First off, my name is Colin Huffine. I work with the Ecosystems Connections Institute, and just for a little bit of background into today's workshop and some additional information, I'm also acting as the watershed coordinator for the Huntington County Soil and Water Conservation District's Upper Wabash River Watershed Management Plan project, which is a grant project that was awarded to the Huntington County SWCD through an IDEM Clean Water Act Section 205J grant. And so that project's main goal is to develop and publish what's known as a watershed management plan for a portion of the Upper Wabash River watershed that covers portions from western Allen County, just west of Fort Wayne, Indiana, down to the northeast portion of northeast portion of Wabash County in Indiana. So that watershed management plan really is devised to identify critical areas within that project area, critical sub-watersheds, as far as which areas are contributing to water quality issues like non-point source pollution, so runoff of nitrogen and phosphorus, sediment, E. coli as well. So identifying those critical areas and then developing a plan to address those water quality issues through implementation of agricultural best management practices and urban best management practices. So another component of that project is a water quality sampling program, which is integrated into the watershed management plan to help identify those critical sub-watersheds. So over the course of a year, we sampled water at 19 different sites throughout the project area to get a current data set of what water quality conditions are like, and use that to inform the watershed management plan. So the last kind of component of the project, last but not least, I should say, is an education and outreach component. So we have education outreach geared more toward the general public, where we do things like river cleanup events. So we've done an annual river cleanup on a portion of the Little River through Huntington, Indiana. And over the last 3 years, volunteers have removed over 2 tons of garbage and debris through a 1.5 mile stretch of the Little River. So it's a good way to get people out involved and learn a little bit about their water resources. But more specific to today, we also have an education outreach program geared more toward agricultural practices and agricultural conservation. So the goal is to provide farmers with content geared toward implementing conservation practices to improve soil health, improve water quality, improve the functioning of their farm system. So that's really the catalyst for today's farm drainage workshop, is really a product of our Upper Wabash River watershed project, and in trying to provide some educational content for local farmers throughout the state and within our specific project area. So we have a great lineup of speakers today, and there's going to be a lot of good information. I'm excited about everyone that we have on board as far as presenters go. So we have Eileen Kladivko, Purdue University professor of agronomy. We also have Frank Gibbs with Wetland and Soil Consulting Services, LLC, as well as Dr. Jerry Sweden with Ecosystems Connections Institute, LLC, and Ed Ferris, who is a Purdue Extension educator. So great lineup, and should be fantastic information that you can hopefully take away and implement into your farm system. So as far as how today is going to operate, each presentation will last about 25 minutes or so, and it'll be followed by a short Q&A session, about 5 minutes or so in length. So you'll have time to ask each of the presenters a few questions if you want to. So I should mention that there are PARP credits as well as commercial category 1 and 14 credits available. You should have registered for those beforehand and paid beforehand if you are wanting to receive those credits. If you have any questions or concerns about them, you can send those to Ed Ferris and contact him directly. He'll be kind of managing those credits. So just make sure he knows that you are present. For example, if you are on a Zoom account under a different name, or if you are sharing a screen with somebody, make sure he knows that you are present so you can receive your credits. So what I'd like to do is in a moment turn it over to Jessica Hain, who is going to provide a quick tutorial on the Zoom platform, just to make sure everybody's comfortable and that the workshop can flow as smoothly as possible. So, but before that, I just want to mention at the end of the workshop, we're going to have some poll questions, and she can kind of show you where the polls are located. But we'll have 3 quick poll questions for you to answer at the end of the workshop, just to kind of address how you viewed things. So don't leave after the last presentation. Hang around and just answer those quick questions for us. So with that being said, I would like to turn it over to Jessica Hain, who is the South Program Manager for CCSI, to provide a brief tutorial on the Zoom platform and some of the workings within Zoom. So Jessica, it's all yours.
All right, thank you. Yep, we don't want to assume that anybody knows the functions of Zoom, but I know many of us have become very proficient with this platform. We are using Zoom Meeting today. And if you are using a PC or a Mac, there's a couple controls. I want to make sure you know where they are. In the bottom left-hand corner, your mute, or your, even if you haven't joined your audio yet, can be found there. A lot of times if you have low bandwidth and you want to use your phone audio, you can switch that from your computer to your phone there as well, along with your start and stop your video. Also, if you're on a PC or Mac, in the middle on the bottom of your screen are your chat function. So Colin had mentioned that we'll be taking questions at any time for any of the speakers. So again, at any time you can hit that chat button, type your question in, and we will be here to monitor those questions and to present them to the speakers at the appropriate time. In the upper right-hand corner, again, if you're on a PC or Mac, are the different views. So if you're in what we call the gallery view right now, and you want just the active speaker, you can click that and change that. Or if you want to go back the other way, that's where you can change the view you are seeing. If you're on an iPad or an iPhone, and I should mention that if you haven't used your screen, haven't touched your screen for a while, sometimes these buttons will go to sleep. So if you're on a device, tap your screen, or if you're on your PC or Mac, you can move your mouse to get the buttons to pop back up. But your mute and your video buttons are in the upper right-hand corner. And to get to the chat, you have to click those 3 little dots above the word more to find the chat box. And if for some reason you need to change from your front to your back camera, that button can be found in the upper left-hand corner, as well as changing again those speaker or to gallery view. That button's there on the upper left-hand corner. And if you're on an Android, changing from your front to back camera is in the upper left-hand corner. And then also down there on the bottom is your mute or join audio, stop video. And then again, your chat, to find your chat function, you're going to have to hit those 3 little dots in the bottom right-hand corner above the word more. Colin had mentioned the poll that we will have at the end. Again, it's 3 short questions, and we will, when we run that poll, it'll just pop up on your screen and you'll see those questions there. But other than that, that is all I have. And I should include, I'm going to turn it over to Eileen. So our first speaker up is Eileen Kladivko, who, as Colin mentioned, is with the agronomy department at Purdue, and she's going to discuss soil drainage, crop yields, cover crop growth, and then nitrate leaching. So now I'll turn it over to you, Eileen.
Okay, Jessica, please just verify that you can hear me and see my slide.
Check, check. You're good to go.
Good.
All right, excellent. Thank you very much. All right, I'm going to start my timer, keep myself on time here. So thank you, and thank you for all attending. I know it's a beautiful day in many places right now, so it's very tempting to be outside, but thank you for tuning in and listening to some information about drainage. And I'm going to be talking about some long-term results primarily from a project in southeastern Indiana in Jennings County, which I realize is not Huntington County. But what I'm going to talk about is the what we've learned from that are much more general learnings and findings for drainage all over Indiana and much of the Midwest. So obviously, you all know that naturally poorly drained soils can be pretty challenging for us to manage for crop production. And so one of the very common practices that we use throughout the Midwest is subsurface tile drainage. And I like to just kind of remind people that tiles are also seasonal in function. They're not generally running all year. And so we have to keep that in mind when we're looking at the impacts of tile drains on nitrate and how we might manage that better. So I have been running a long-term tile drainage research project at CPAC, the Southeast Purdue Ag Center, down here in southeastern Indiana in Jennings County, since right after I actually joined the Purdue faculty back in 1982. I was the new kid on the block, and I had some great mentors in some Jerry Mannering and Ed Monk and Ron Wheaton, who a few of you might know those names, but they were very, very influential in getting this research started down in southeastern Indiana. It had been asked for by the farmers in that region because in the 70s, modern perforated plastic drain tube started to become available, and the soils in that part of the state had not traditionally been tile drained. So they asked Purdue to do some work on tile drainage. So the original objectives were to take that soil, the Claremont silt loam soil, which was poorly structured and very low organic matter and poorly drained, and first of all, to test out whether the drainage could be improved by using plastic tubing, and then to also see if the soil physical properties could be improved, because that soil had tremendous problems with crusting and erosion, and wanted to increase water flow through the soil, and then of course to improve crop growth and yield. So the experimental site was set up with drains installed at 4 different spacings because my senior colleagues wanted to look at what is the effect of different tile spacings on crop growth and yield. And so the spacings were 5, 10, 20, and 40 meters, or 16, 33, 66, and 132 feet. And this, this widest one here, the 40 meter or 132 feet, was so far apart for that soil that it was basically considered to be the control, the undrained control, because the water flow was so slow that you would not basically have any impact of drainage on the fields. The tiles were installed at 2.5 to 3 feet depth, which kept it above the fragipan, which was the restricting layer that was at about 3.5 to 4 feet deep, and it was standard perforated plastic drain tube. The tiles were installed actually in February and March of 1983. Some of you may remember 1983 was another drought year, not as severe as 2012, but it was a drought year. And the tiles were installed with the standard equipment at the time, the trencher and the laser guided machinery. That was the main drain there along Highway 50. And then we have our laterals going up into the field. The laterals did first exit into a metal culvert where we could sample them and measure the flow. And then from there, the water was routed to the main drain next to the highway and to the ditch. So I'm going to give you 35 years of results in less than 30 minutes. So I'm just going to hit a few highlights. The first one is that drainage pays. One of the ways that it pays is that drainage improves timeliness of field work. So on this particular site, during the first 10 years of this long-term project, we were using tillage. We were using spring chisel tillage, which was the common practice in that part of the state. So the different drain spacings were chiseled and planted when the soil was ready. So in other words, the superintendent of the farm and I we would go out and we would look at the field. If the 5 meter, the narrow spacing was ready to till, they would till it and the next day plant it. If the 10 meter was still a little too wet, we'd wait and go out the next day and look and do the same kind of thing. And as you can imagine, you know, in some years, we're going to have the first couple of drain spacings that get tilled and planted. And then what happens? Well, it rains before the next one was really ready. And so then you go back to ground zero to basically start drying out the field again. So what that meant is that over the course of that first 10 years, the undrained control plot was delayed from the narrowest drain spacing. In some years, only a day because it was a warm, dry spring. In other years, it was up to 15 days because we got a couple of rains in between. And so obviously that kind of more timely access to the field is going to be a major benefit to most farming operations. This is just an image to illustrate that drying of the soil. You can see here the superintendent drew these lines for the tiles on top of this image here. And you can see the light color, the light colored soil there, showing that the soil was drying out more quickly, was draining more quickly where we had the tiles. The dark colored soil here in between is that undrained control I was mentioning. So the dark colored soil meaning that it's not draining, not drying out as much. So the first question about would these tiles even work on this soil was clearly answered that yes, in fact, drainage happened with the tiles very, very effectively. Okay, crop yields varied year by year, of course, and the differences among the spacings varied year by year. So if we look first at the first 10 years, and then we'll get into the more recent values. So all the way here on the right, we have the 10-year average of our 4 drain spacings. So the narrow spacing, the 5 meter spacing, the dark blue on the left, and then progressively decreasing yields until we get to this undrained control in the light blue on the right. And on average, over that first 10 years, there was a 10 bushel yield difference between the undrained control and the narrowest drain spacing, which frankly was much less than what we had anticipated. And it was a little disappointing to me as a young researcher that it was only 10 bushels difference. But it did get more as we go on, and I'll show you that. But part of the reason was that most of those years were actually, if anything, on the dry side, not on the wet side, with a couple exceptions, like I talked about, that timeliness basis. But you can see that in some years, the narrowest drain spacing had the highest yield, and it went progressively lower and lower as the drains got further apart. You can see that some years, the intermediate spacings were the best. In 7 of the 10 years, the undrained control was the lowest yielding of all of them. So again, showing that drainage pays in terms of crop yields. It's not just yields, of course. You also have grain moisture. And here, this is the grain moisture content averaged over the first 10 years. We did not harvest on different days. We harvested them all at the same time. And so you can see that on average over the 10 years, there was a 2-point difference in moisture. The 5 meter or 16-foot spacing had 21% grain moisture, whereas the undrained control was up at 23% moisture. So that 2-point difference in moisture, of course, would mean a difference in drying costs for the farmer. So again, another economic benefit of drainage. In the later years, we had much more difference in yield. So here I'm showing you the corn yields during the 2007 to 2017 time period. After the first 10 years, we switched to a corn-soybean rotation, or in some cases, a corn-soybean rotation. So here I've got illustrated all the corn years during this period. And you can see that some years there wasn't very much difference in yields depending on the spacing. So 2007 and 2011, not a whole lot of difference in yields. But all the rest of these years here, you can see a tremendous difference in yield, with the undrained control being 50 bushels or more different than our drained treatments. Our drained treatments, for the most part, weren't that different from each other, but the undrained control was much, much lower. And this is due in large part to the fact that we had much wetter years during that later period. So again, here, drainage is really paying to have any of those drain spacings compared to the undrained control. Another aspect of timeliness, even though we planted all these plots on the same day after the first 10 years, is a replant. So all of our plots were planted the same day starting in 1994 because we had switched from doing chisel tillage and needing to wait until the top 6 to 8 inches was suitable for tillage. We had switched to no-till, so that meant we really only had to wait for the top inch or two to be ready for seeding. But as you know, getting it seeded is one thing, but is it too wet for adequate growth? So if it continued to be wet after planting, in the extreme, it might mean replanting. And so 2017 is a great example of that. This whole field was planted on May 16th, but the undrained control didn't make it. And so it was replanted on June 2nd. And this photo was taken on June 12th. So you can see in the middle of the picture here, looking towards the trees in the back, you can see soil that has just barely started to get corn rows recognizable in it. That's our 40-meter control, and that's the growth from the replant. Whereas on either side of it is the corn that was from the original planting on May 16th. So even though we planted everything at the same time and we were timely, the one didn't make it and we had to replant it, which is the epitome of not being very timely. So to summarize those parts, drainage pays, drainage improves crop yields. If you look at all the corn years over the whole experiment, which was about 24 corn years, the undrained control averaged 144 bushels per acre, whereas all of the drainage treatments were in the 160s, and this narrower drain spacing was up at 168, so a 24 bushel yield difference. So drainage really pays for crop growth and production. Soybean yields on this particular field, we actually didn't see any consistent differences. If you look here at this right-hand set of bars, the average of all the soybean years from 94 to 18, which was about 10 years, very little difference, no statistical difference in soybean yield for all the spacings. This shows some of those years, and you can see that in 2018, it happened that the undrained control was much lower than the 3 drainage treatments. But in other years, you can see that the undrained control was actually a little higher than all the drainage treatments. And on average, we basically did not see any significant difference for soybeans. Okay, what about surface drainage? We do have good surface drainage on this field, which I get reminded of regularly when I give talks down in the CPAC area. The farmers there remind me that I have slightly more slope on my field than do many of the very flat, large, broad flats of the Claremont fields. So you would expect that if we have good surface drainage, if we don't happen to have ponding and areas where water accumulates, that maybe the impacts of subsurface drainage would not be as dramatic as on more typical farmer fields. So I want to show you the impact of tiles versus the extreme of no tiles on another part of that same field that did not have as good surface drainage. So this part of the field, we had what we were calling agronomic management practices to try to improve soil properties. And the year after we ended that experiment, they just planted corn straight through the whole area. And this untiled area where there were no drains installed got planted 3 times and drowned out 3 times. And then they basically gave up. And in the background where there were tiles, it got planted and it grew well from the first planting. And you can see all the corn stubble here. So again, obviously for a farmer who's got a field that has less than perfect surface drainage, where there's a little bit of ponding or accumulation of water, the difference between no yield and a good yield is obviously very, very significant. Drainage pays in other ways. In this case, it pays by improving cover crop growth. On that field, in the later parts of the field, in our drain spacing field, we planted cover crops, and by this point in the experiment, we were using cereal rye after corn, before soybeans. And you can see here in the upper left where we had the tile drained plots. On May 13th of 2016, right before we were ready to terminate it and plant our soybeans, it had been a wet year. We hadn't been able to get in. And before soybeans, we are perfectly happy to let our cover crop grow longer. We had about 3,100 pounds of top growth biomass per acre. On the untiled plots, that undrained plot, we had less than 1/4 of the growth. We had about 700 pounds of biomass. We had a good stand, but it just didn't grow because it was too wet. So again, if you're going to take the time and effort to grow cover crops, you're doing it for some reason. Maybe you want to trap nitrogen to keep it from leaching away. Maybe you want to improve soil health, but you're doing it for a purpose. And so if that's the case, then you want the cover crop to grow, and tile drainage is going to help that. I'm going to switch gears and talk about that experiment where I showed you the picture where it got completely drowned out 1 year. And that's drainage experiment 2. I usually talk about these drain spacings, and that's what I just did. But now we're going to talk very briefly about this experiment where we had a block that was drained and another block that was not drained. We had plots that were split between chisel and no-till. And then we had 5 what we were calling agronomic practices that had as their main purpose to improve soil physical properties as well as crop growth. So our control treatment there was continuous corn. So CC in this case is continuous corn, not cover crop. We then had a treatment that had continuous corn with a winter cover crop of either wheat or cereal rye. Another one with a winter cover crop of annual ryegrass. Another one with dry animal manure that was applied in the spring. And then the 5th one was a 3-year rotation where we had corn, wheat, and orchard grass, red clover, meadow. At this time, we were hand broadcasting the covers into these plots, into the standing corn each autumn. These were 100-foot long plots, so it was work, but it was doable to hand broadcast these cover crops at that time. So I'm going to show you just a couple of things from this experiment. The first one is the corn grain yields and the percent increase that we got in those grain yields as a result of tiling over this 9-year project period. So the blue bars are the tiled, the red bars are the untiled. And the percentages that I've got listed here is the percent increase for tiling compared to the untiled. So you can see that for the continuous corn, we had a 12% increase in yield where we had tile versus where we did not have tile. But for the conservation practices, we were more like a 20% increase in the yield compared to the untiled. So the tile is helping us reap those conservation benefits. The other way to look at this data is to just kind of look straight across on all the tileds and straight across on all the untileds. So if we look at it that way, we see that for the tiled, the blue bars, the conservation practices were equal or greater in yield than was continuous corn. So we were having some benefit of those practices. For the untiled, the conservation practices were equal or lower than the control. Okay, so basically our conservation practices weren't really doing us any or not very much good, because they couldn't perform as well in this very wet environment. I've also done some work with earthworms on and off over the time I've been at Purdue, and we were doing a lot of earthworm work at the time. So we did find earthworm populations were generally higher with certain practices, certainly no-till versus chisel, and that's been found at this project and other projects that we've looked at Purdue and on farmers' fields across the state, as well as many other researchers. We found earthworm populations generally were higher where we had tiling versus where we did not have tile because of the better aerated condition. And we found earthworms generally higher where we did these other conservation practices compared to the control. We also found other soil physical properties that we measured periodically, not regularly, but we measured them periodically, were improved by cover crops and rotation, in particular where we had adequate drainage. So aggregate stability, which is the ability of that soil to resist erosion, and water infiltration were improved with those practices, again, more so where we had adequate drainage, because those practices just worked better. So the bottom line of that then is that drainage pays. It enables other conservation practices to work better. So in naturally poorly drained soils, whether it's the Claremont in southeastern Indiana or soils up in northern Indiana, conservation practices are generally going to be more effective both in improving crop yields and in improving soil physical properties and soil health in tiled versus untiled fields. So the bottom line of that is you need adequate drainage first before you're really able to significantly improve your crop yields and soil health with these other conservation practices. All right, one last topic before I kind of summarize this. Drainage does affect water flow and water quality, and you're going to hear more about that later this afternoon as well. But the first point I want to make is that when we bring drains closer together, okay, so closer drain spacings lose more water, and therefore they also lose more nitrate in tile drain flow. So the whole point of putting drains closer together, right? If you put drains closer together, why do you do that? You do that because you want to get rid of more water faster. Okay, that's the point of putting drains closer together. And so if you do that and you get rid of more water faster, the nitrate is just in the soil. It's not held by the soil. And so it just goes along with the water as well. So I'm going to show you two different time periods just to illustrate this. In the early part of our experiment from 86 to 88, we were using high fertilizer nitrogen rates, continuous corn, no cover crop, chisel tillage. And if you look at the gold bar here is the 20 meter or 66-foot spacing. We were losing on average about 23 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year coming out the tile drain. As those tiles got brought closer together, there was more water lost and more nitrate lost. And in our narrow spacing, we were losing 44 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year just coming out the tile. This is high. This was common at the time for that region. I would say in the Midwest, that number is much less now, in part because fertilizer rates have changed, in part because cover crops are being used. But this basically is saying that as we intensify drainage, we want to be a little careful about that because we can lose more nitrate. So a good point is that cover crops are one way that we can very effectively reduce that nitrate loss. So here's an example of data from the ending of the first 15 years of this long-term study. So from 97 to 99, we grew cover crops, we changed our fertilizer rate, we switched to a corn soybean rotation. And you can see that these nitrogen losses are much less. We still have this tendency that as we bring those tiles closer together, We still lose more water and we still lose more nitrate, but the overall amounts that we lose are much less because of the effectiveness of those cover crops in scavenging nutrients from the soil. I like to use this picture to kind of illustrate this and maybe jog our brains in a slightly different way. You all know that our corn and soybean system is normally fallow from October through April, right? We have nothing growing. Unfortunately, most of the water and nitrate that we lose in our tile drains comes out exactly in that fallow season. At CPAC, the drains start flowing in November and they flow more or less all winter, and they quit sometime in May or June. You folks are a little further north, so you have some intermittent flow in the winter, but you still lose most of your water in the drains comes out during the time of year that we typically don't have a crop growing. So the whole point of a winter cover crop is that by planting something in September, October, November, it's growing, it's taking up nitrogen, it's lowering the amount of nitrogen that's available to be washed out by that drain flow through the winter and early spring. And if it's a cover crop that goes dormant and comes back again in the spring, then that means it's taking up nitrogen actively again in the spring. But even if it's a winter kill cover crop, it has lowered that amount of nitrogen that's able to be washed out by the drain flow during that fall, winter, and early spring period. So keeping something growing for as much of the year as we can is really key to reducing those nitrate losses, and is very effective and has been shown all throughout the Midwest. So tile drains really are a long-term investment. Drainage flow does develop with time. I didn't talk about that today, but the process of changing the soil does take some time. Crop yield effects are going to vary from year to year based on the weather. Conservation practices themselves also take time to improve soil health. But the long-term improvement that we do see in cash crop yields and cover crop growth and the effectiveness of those other conservation practices make tile drains a very good investment. So if you're interested in more details, of course, I love to talk about this project because I've spent much of my career down there working on this. I've got some videos and some extension pubs that if you'd like to hear more about it. So I've got parts 1, 2, and 3 go into more detail than what I was able to do today. So yields and timeliness is part 1, cover crops and conservation practices part 2, drain flow and nitrate loads and cover crop impacts on that in much more detail than what I just did is part 3. You can find them at my drainage website, and/or you can read the extension publications that are on those same topics available on my drainage website or the Purdue Education Store. So with that, I am going to stop and turn it back over to whoever is in charge right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eileen. That's fantastic information. And as we had discussed previously, it's, I know it's difficult to fit 35 years worth of data into a presentation in about a half-hour time slot, but you did it great. So thank you very much. We do have some time now. If anybody would like to ask Eileen some questions about her research, you have basically 2 options. You can type your questions directly into the chat if you prefer to do that, and then I can help facilitate those questions with Eileen. And then if you would prefer, you can also just turn on your mic and ask her a question directly. So we'll take some time here and allow anybody that has a question to ask it. So. Don't be shy if you have a question. One thing I should have mentioned, and I should have asked the presenters beforehand, but if it's okay, if we could provide the speakers' emails in the chat, just in case if somebody comes up with a question after the fact and they want to direct them directly to the presenter after the fact, we can do that as well. But I would encourage you to take advantage of this time here face to face somewhat if you do have a question for Eileen.
Okay, I got one. How about, will there be, this presentation will be available afterwards? And
Yeah,
then,
so, yep, go ahead.
go ahead. Well, go ahead.
Yeah, so we're recording the workshop, and we are working on putting together. It'll be available hopefully on Huntington County SWCD's YouTube channel within hopefully a day or so. So it will be made available.
Okay, good. And then Eileen, there was a slide that one of them you had on there that the corn was wetter over the years, but then I think later you said that they were all planted on the same day. So, you know, I understand if you said you started working some of the fields when it was ready, but then did you then not plant until all the same day on all of them?
Yeah, no, there's two different time periods. So the grain moisture differences that I showed were from the first 10 years when we did plant on different days. And then starting year 11, we no longer planted on different days, and the grain moisture differences don't apply to that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, because that's what I was thinking. If corn wasn't planted, if you planted 110 day corn, the first one would dry if it was planted, you know, a week before the second one, and you know, it would just dry down faster.
Right. Yeah. So the moisture differences were for the first 10 years when we planted on different days. And, you know, there was a couple of years where that undrained control was planted 2 weeks later. So it was definitely wetter. Right. Okay, but then later on, we planted them all on the same day. So, yeah.
Okay. Might ask you this, just was thinking about it. Pattern tiling, do you think there's a risk of necessarily, I mean, if you run your rows north and south, do you run your tile north and south too? I mean, do you think there's ever the chance of possibly running a tile by running straight over it, that kind of thing, at one time or another?
Of ruining the tile by running straight over it?
Yeah, like if it runs straight north and south, and you just happen to have your wheel track right over the top of the tile, and it happens to be a muddy year or something, you know, whatever.
Yeah.
Obviously, it depends on how deep it is, but you know, I'm just thinking out loud.
Yeah. I think in general, general practice for installation of tiles is that they're deep enough that they're below the possibility of being damaged by field traffic. I think you'd have to be up to your axle to be getting to the depth of the tile. 2.5 feet is usually as shallow as we recommend. I mean, I know some people are thinking about 2 foot. You got to start to be really careful there. You know, if you're somebody who might occasionally use deep ripping, you might be at 14 to 18 inches, but the tiles are generally deep enough that should not be an issue. There are sometimes other reasons that people want to put the tiles perpendicular to the way they do the rows, but that's actually a lot of times more of a research thing, because if you have tiles that are parallel to the rows, you have to make sure that your plots are wide enough that it goes from mid-plane to mid-plane, right? So you're getting uniform. You don't have one plot that's over the tile and one plot that's between tiles. But from the farming standpoint, I don't think there's a strong reason to go one way or the other.
Okay, well, I do know that, you know, we got some pretty flat land, and we had some tile installation back in the 70s, and I know that my cousin used a ripper at one point in time and did damage several tiles.
Huh.
You know, I'm no-till now and stuff, and at the same time, there's still a pocket here and there that's low, but the tiles have been damaged over the years, so we're going to replace some of that, but I just thinking out loud.
Yeah, I mean, I can't argue with what you have observed, and if that happened, then that happened. But I'm wondering how shallow the tile was at that particular point, because even how deep was the deep ripper? because that's pretty deep. If it's a 2.5 foot deep tile and the Deep Ripper hit it, that either means there was a lot of erosion off the top and then the Deep Ripper hit it, or it was probably shallower than 2.5 feet maybe. But
yeah, probably. I don't recall for sure, but I just remember it being damaged, and we fixed several of them over the years.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, sure. Colin, can I take just a minute to answer this one, because I think
yes.
Because of the time, I didn't have time to go into all of our management practices, but I do want to make it a very strong point that our nitrogen is applied in the spring, and in the later parts of the experiment was actually even side dress. So the fact that we lose nitrogen in the winter is not because we put the nitrogen on in the fall. The reason we lose nitrogen all throughout the winter is for two reasons. One is you might have a little left over from your corn fertilizer if the corn didn't use it all, but also you just have natural mineralization from the soil organic matter. So all of our data is from either pre-plant, spring, and hydrous, the first 15 years or so, and then after that, a little starter and then side dress. So we do not have fall. There is a trade-off between drainage and nutrient loss, and that's why in my fuller version of this, I kind of go into, if you're going to put tiles closer together, then you also need to intensify something else, not just your drainage management. You need to intensify, for example, using cover crops or using controlled drainage, where you moderate the drainage during the times of year where you don't really need drainage in the winter. So we don't want to put them as close together as we possibly can. We want to put them just close enough to get the yield benefits that we need, but also intensify our management of other things like cover crops, for example. I did also put not only my email, but I what was on that last slide again, that drainage website has the talk I just gave today in lengthier, in 3 parts, so you don't have to listen to it all at once, but it has more details on all of those as well as the publications. So,
with what you just said, as far as determining the width or the distance between tiles,
yeah.
With that being said, I mean, how do you really go about justifying, or I mean, determining what tile spacing to use?
That's an excellent question, and we do have a drainage publication. I didn't even put that on our on my slide today, that gives approximations for all the different soils in the state of Indiana. It gives approximate guidelines for spacings to consider. That's available online. I can try to look up the link while I'm listening to the next speaker and put that on there. But it's also a matter of a lot of times the contractors who do work in the area will make recommendations. Of course, they may or may not make them narrower, recommendations than is necessary. It kind of depends on experience. It's not an easy question to answer. I would say start with looking at the recommendations and they tend to be conservative, and then you might go narrower from there, but that would at least give you some idea. I'll look that link up and put it on there as one place of finding some information.
Great. Thank you, Eileen, very much. Now, she mentioned if you have any additional questions, she has provided her email address in the chat, so you can direct those directly to her email. So thanks again, Eileen. Really appreciate it. Fantastic information, great presentation. So
thank you.
Yep. With that, we'll kind of transition into our next presentation. So up next, we have Frank Gibbs, soil and wetland scientist, retired USDA NRCS, and the founder of Wetland and Soil Consulting Services, LLC. So with his presentation on soil health with earthworms, make your soil smoke. So Frank, the floor is yours now.
Okay, thanks a lot. I just have to say amen to what Eileen just presented to you. Can you see the first slide yet?
Yes. Yep. Looks good.
All right, I did this same presentation just recently for Indigo Ag. This picture here is my first oxy soil. I've been around a lot of places. This is Ecuador, and that was pretty cool. I retired with 36 years with NRCS and SCS in Northwest Ohio. I was the area soil scientist, and I formed in 2012 WSCS LLC. I'm a professional wetland scientist, a certified professional supplier, professional soil scientist, and a certified crop advisor. I'm probably best known for my smoking tile presentation, which you see here was being done at the Ohio State Manure Science Review. I don't know if any of you know Glenn Arnold. He's our OSU manure specialist. He's a pretty hyper guy. He's always doing something, inventing something. This is a applicator that he invented with the Vinicotti brothers in Putnam County, 12-foot hoses. I got a rod man line going to a tanker full of hog manure, liquid hog manure, and then this thing is 12 foot high off the ground with the booms. He can drag it through standing corn and apply manure. And he was in front of me. I was down in this pit getting my tile hookup done when all of a sudden there's 250 people here. I heard screaming, I heard laughing, I heard yelling, and I looked up out of here, and a big slug of air came down this rodman line. And when it hit here, these 12-foot hoses started snapping 24 feet up in the earth, turned it into a giant shit squid, and threw shit all over everybody. So, you know, sometimes shit just happens. And that didn't bother Glenn at all. He just kept talking. So sometimes that's the way things go. I want to talk to you today about using earthworms to improve your soil health, protect yourself when things go wrong. Soil compaction, one of the wettest years in record. Principles of soil health, improve your drainage power, how to make your soil smoke by using a system of conservation, tillage, no-till, strip-till, zone-till, controlled traffic, cover crops, and drainage. So sometimes things go right. I mean, we just had the Perseverance land on Mars and things went great. And you know where we started out, things didn't go right when we landed on the moon with Apollo 11. That was my dad's birthday, 57th birthday. They overshot the site. They were using a computer that wasn't even as good as these iPhones, and Neil had to take over, and he had to land it by hand with just seconds left, 15 seconds exactly, before they would have ran out of fuel and not made it back. So here we are just a couple years ago when looking to my west on the Mike Berry farm, master farmer, nothing planted. I looked to the north on the Paul farm and another 80 acres unplanted. And to the southwest on the Benner farm from my place, unplanted. 25% of Hancock County corn got only that much got planted that year. And 70 to 75% of the soybeans got planted, and they weren't looking very good that they got planted. We were calling it Farmageddon. And here's my field with 50 years of continuous no-till growing there. The whole farm was planted to beans on June 26th. Why did I get in and they didn't get in? Right here. These are all nightcrawler middens. I had 9.7 of them per square foot. That's 422,532 holes per acre. I've highlighted them with paint there so that you can see them better. All of these opening the ground up no-till, strip-till, zone-till, the less you till the soil, the better off it's going to be. And when we had Isaac came through in 2012. These things just keep happening. Look at this, almost 9 inches orbing into you guys there in Indiana. We have to have programs that we can deal with these intensive storms because our soils are poorly drained for the most part in Northwest Ohio. And we got to move that water into the ground. Otherwise, it's going to run off and take everything that we've paid our good hard money into the creeks and streams, and also cause problems with algae blooms. Tile drainage is a big deal where I'm from, as you can see here in the Putnam County rednecks have on their tile truck. So this is probably one of the most important slides. This is from my Dr. Hall from Ohio State when I was in college, and I asked him if I could have this slide, and then you can see how old it is. Dr. Hall just died last summer of COVID in a nursing home. But look what half of the soil, a good silt loam soil, topsoil, is made out of. 25% air, 25% water. That's 50% airspace. Pore space, places to move the water. And we have different textures of soil. You can pack these together and have different hypothetical pore spaces. But here's what we're trying to do. Everything needs air to live, and so do those roots. We can't have saturation in there. We want to take the gravitational water out so that we have water available for the plant roots to suck off of that's clinging to these particles, and they'll pull it until it becomes so thin and so tightly held to those particles that they can't pull anymore and they wilt. So between field capacity and wilting, that's this area in here. And we're going to start out down here with sand, and we're going to go through silt loams and loams and over here to clay. And if you don't get anything else out of this, the silts and the silt loams have the greatest capacity to hold water that the plant can use. Sand doesn't hold very much, gives it up easy. Clay holds the most, but it holds it so tightly, it's not as much of it available in this place here for the plants to use. Of course, structure is a big deal. We want to have granular and blocky structure. We don't want platy compacted structure or massive structure like our glacial till or heavy compacted soils. We want to get a good root growth, and if we don't have drainage, we're pruning off our roots with the water table. So the way to move it through, this is most important, is to have a granular and blocky structure in the topsoil granular and in the subsoil blocky, not plate or massive. Soil compaction is a big deal where I'm from. I remember the old Germans used to plow the dark soils, the Palama soils in our area. They called it jackwax. Well, it was jackwax because they were plowing it too wet, and they're smearing the clay subsoil off there and shiny and cutting off all those pores. The water can't go through that stuff. It's not a good practice. Here we go. We got heavy axle compaction from honey wagons and grain carts, single axle grain carts that can cause problems. This is probably the worst compaction. This was from a pipeline that went through and left the field a mess. This is right over by you guys on the Indiana line in Van Wert County. This is a Hoytville soil that had plates underneath there holding the roots back. This is another Hoytville in Wood County. Jim Carter at the Soil and Water Office with his dad, they were growing alfalfa in rotation on this heavy clay Hoytville soil like you've got up around Fort Wayne. Look at these nice little blocks of clay, just wonderful. And right across the fence row, this is Hoytville clay too, folks. This field here was beaned to death. It was tilled to death. It didn't have any drainage invested in it, or surface drainage or tile drainage. It was owned by an old lady widow. And you know what, folks? Same soil. Management, management, management. Surface compaction is a problem too. It can cut off the drainage. This is a field again over by you guys in Paulding County on those real heavy Paulding clays and the Roselle clays. You need to have controlled traffic. You can see here, this is the soybeans emerging after a 2-inch rain. And it's emerging where it hasn't been driven over, but all the tracks are showing up because the beans aren't up. So you can see where the fertilizer applicator went. You can see where it was chiseled this way in the fall, and the field cultivators run this way in the spring. And then you can see the split duals where they planted it. And then this is a ditch coming to a point with a road, and you can see all the cat asses that they cut down here and just compacted everything. It makes a difference. Now, a lot of folks have been talking about handling that with subsoilers. Folks, this has been going on forever. Look what I looked like doing this field day. We would get these things out and run them side by side and take a backhoe and dig up and see what kind of shattering they did. The straight shanks, of course, they make vertical rips in the soil. They don't shatter out much in between. You have big pillars of unshattered soil. You can put wings on them and then it'll shatter out further to the point where it'll be like a wave going through the soil. Again, you only do this when it's dry. You don't subsoil when it's wet, or you're just doing more damage than if you just stayed out of the field. Here's where mostly our folks use them, in tomato fields that they've just hogged the tomatoes out of. Just terrible abuse of the soil. There's just, I've been out on fields that they said that the tile, they were newly tiled, and they said the tile was off grade, and it wasn't anything to do with that. It was compaction like this. Look at our nice little blocks of soil down here, all squished into one giant boulder. How in the world would the water ever get down through this? All that money spent on drainage tile, and they can't work. Terrible, terrible compaction. And loadout zones. Loadout zones can be the worst. So we want multiple axles under these grain carts. We want to spread out the weight with tracks. We want to use cover crops, deep-rooted legumes or radishes like we see here in the Hoytville clay. Vetch can do a good job. Here's a Toledo silty clay up by the lake and a laddie clay in this field that were shattered by those roots. Just beautiful blocks of soil again. The principles of soil health, folks, are to limit soil disturbance. Number one, increase soil microbial diversity by growing a variety of rotation and using cover crops. Keep those living roots in there year round, keep the soil covered, and reduce compaction. And you can do this by using earthworms and a conservation system of no-till, strip-till, zone-till, controlled traffic and cover crops. And like Eileen said, the foundation of it is drainage. 2015, it was cold, it rained. I got like 19.5 inches of rain on my soil out of my 34.5 annual rainfall amount. Some of the worst places hit was Defiance County, Ohio, over again by you folks. This is some pictures from that day. I'd already had half my yearly rainfall, and I got a 3.5 to 4 inch storm in 2 hours. I had to go to my church 8 miles away at Pandora, Ohio. And on the way there, everybody that was ripping and doing tillage, the water was just running across the road with the mud. Just terrible. I raced back to my place to see what it looks like. Here's my buildings. I got a waterway with a 22-inch tile in here, 150 acres coming down through here. And what do you see? You see no water. And that's because it goes over my sister who's doing the same practices I do on her 80. You can see just a little water coming across from the neighbors here, and then it's soaking in. We soaked it up. We soaked it up. This is a good buddy of mine from 3rd grade. I say this and he gets mad at me, says we were friends in 1st grade, but he was our football tackle in school. He's doing these. This is the day after that big rain. This is on July 10th. He's got no-till soybeans drilled into rye. I went over there. I said, Denny, boy, it doesn't look like you got much rain. He said, bullshit, get in the car. We go to eat ribs at this little town called New Regal and drink beer about 4 times a year. We went down County Road 9 in Hancock County. These are some of the biggest farmers in our county. These fields were systematically tiled, but they ruined the soil structure by working it so that the water couldn't get down the tile. And that's a field of corn right there. I got a call that same year from Detroit, and I almost didn't answer it. I thought, who do I know in Detroit? I don't want to talk to these people. And I answered it, and it was like right away, this is the NPR station in Detroit. Does Frank Gibbs, you know anything about drainage tile? So I knew exactly where this was going. They wanted to come out and look at my farm and all this stuff. And I said, no, you're not. You're going to go to the Soil and Water Conservation Chairman. I'm going to take you out to other farmers that are doing all this stuff. And this is Brent Margoff from Seneca County. Brent hosted our Ohio No-Till Field Day the year before. He let me dig a 30-foot trench across his corn so I could show, because he's doing all these things, including controlled traffic, where he's just compacting just little narrow strips into the corn. This cornfield the year before was wheat, and he had left all the wheat on there, didn't bale it off in the fall, well, in July, and drilled 2 legumes for nitrogen, 2 brassicas to hold the nitrogen over the winter, and then 2 grasses for more carbon, and then some buckwheat for the heck of it because he had some buckwheat left. In the spring, Ohio State helped us harvest this in plots and dry it and send it into Spectrum Labs down in Washington Courthouse. 13,000 pounds of dry residue on that surface in the spring that he planted this corn into. 13,000 pounds. That would be a good hay crop, wouldn't it? Okay, here's what it looked like in September when we had our field day. Where'd that all go? The FFA boys said, well, it must wash down the hill. The heck it did. Look at this. He built up his earthworm populations that they ate every stick of this stuff except for a few coarse corn stalks, and they want more. They're dragging the corn leaves down in the hole. This is just amazing. Taking all that carbon and putting it into, turning it into worm shit, and then lining your holes all the way down 6 feet. What a great place for a root to grow. Well, they got everything they need. They got air, they got water, they got organic matter, food. It's just a great system to recycle this stuff and build your organic matter. We even got a cover crop beer that our guys put together that somebody brewed in Columbus. This is in Fulton County. My buddies Jerry and Wes Seiler had a field day. We expected in 2017 about 120 people, and we ended up with over 260 people. There's other players I know you've run into before, like Joe Nestor and some of the ag agents. It was just a really so great day. And I did the same thing over there that Brent did. They had some of the best wheat that they had ever raised. They left all the straw, and then they went in with their Kinsey planter and they put on 22 pounds in 15-inch rows, 4 pounds of small seeds and 15 inches, and then 18 pounds of large seed in the other 15 inches. That wheat was 114 bushel wheat, the best wheat they ever raised. They put in radishes, turnips, hairy vetch, winter peas, buckwheat, and then this is the following spring. 12.3 tons per acre of dry matter sent off there. They also had a strip where we put in fertilizer bander with a high-speed applicator that John Deere helped develop. And that area there had 15.5 tons of dry matter. Fertilizer was 250 pounds a half MAP, 1152.0, and then potash for the other half. This is Dave Brandt. I'm sure you've all heard of him. This is his gold standard Bennington. It's too dark now to be a Bennington. Bennington is classified as by the soil science as an ochre crop. It means it's wet. The qualf means the ochre is Latin for pale soil. And it's so dark now on his farm, it needs to be reclassified. This is what his farm looked like a couple of years ago when I did his field day over there in the spring. This is a shot of that same soil, and you got the layers here. You got the topsoil and then the subsoil and then the glacial till down here at the bottom on this Bennington. But you see all these dots, all these little dots. What are all those little dots? Those are night crawler holes and exposed clear down into that till. Already good from Hardin County, 20 years in no-till, 5 years of cover crops. They had me in to do the smoke and tile demonstration, and it worked great. It worked just great. And I didn't think it would work worth a darn. Here's the soil layers. This is a really difficult soil, a Glenwood soil, and the tile was over 4 foot deep. This is a problem because way down there is this hard glacial till, and I didn't think that the water would be able to get to the tile very good or the wormholes. But look at all these little holes pecked in there, clear down that till. They must have hard hats on to be able to do this. It's just unbelievable. So here's a close-up of them. And then you can see the middens there that the smoke is coming out. This is in Lenawee County, Michigan, on Baker Ladd's farm. They've been doing this stuff for years, and you can see the smoke we're making there. That ground was in great shape, just great shape. This is Jerry Suter. I go to church with him in Pandora. He grows sweet corn and melons. That sweet corn is a real great thing. It comes off early. So if he can put in, he's been doing like a organic strip till. He does what Dave Brandt started, putting the radishes in 15-inch rows with Austrian peas, and the peas provide 30 pounds of nitrogen. So the radishes will grow nice and big over the winter, and he can get them in early because he takes sweet corn off, and then he just no-tills right into these rows here where everything is nice and loosened up. Normally I dig these radishes up in March and look at what they've done to the soil. I went over one year right after Christmas. They had a kill and frost and the radishes were dead. Now you'll see lots and lots of red and gray worms on these dead radishes because they have saccharides in. It's like eating candy. And that's what I see in March, but I never dug them up around Christmas. And looky here, they're not on the radishes. They're on the peas. So they're on the peas early in the winter, and then by spring, they move over to the radishes. There's so much we don't know, and this is just 2 species of cover crop. Imagine what it'd be like if you had a 10-way mix. There's just a lot to learn. And I enjoy it being retired now. I can go around in the country and visit people. This is my friend Don Bratton from New York. He bought 2 planters, Kinsey planters, one for beans and one for corn out in Illinois. He does twin row corn. He's experimenting with interseeding, all sorts of stuff. This is his ground in New York. You wouldn't expect it to be as wonderful as what we got in the Midwest. Boy, oh boy, look at all of these night crawler middens and holes down in the pit. Just incredible. And look at the granulation up on top from the castings. He's done a great job with his soil. And those twin row corn, look at the ears. I was using them for a hanger for my changing after I dug the pit before I gave the presentation. Just unbelievable. Just unbelievable. This is a farm in Massachusetts that is using zone till and putting the fertilizer. This is probably the best one I ever did, Monty Bottoms in Moline, Illinois. Just unbelievable amount. Now, this is a mollusk soil, a prairie soil. And then this is in Dave Stutzman's and Mark Freed's place in Normal, Illinois. Double crop beans in the background, lots of middens. They did drone footage of the smoke with the university up above. I just love this. I love meeting every one of these folks. You learn something everywhere you go. This is a soybean research center up in Frankenmuth. And you know what sugar beets do to the ground. Beat the ground up 3 times in a row. They beat it up to work it up fine for the little seeds. They have to dig the beets out and tear it all up, and then they have to beat it down for the fall. And I got like 6 little whiffs of smoke because this stuff had been worked to bug dust. It's a research place. It was tiled every 16 feet, and the water couldn't get through it. It was terrible. These are my buddies again, Jerry and Les Seiler. We do crop patrol. You guys do that? You get, every time I come up to see them, they say, get in the pickup. You won't believe what the hell the neighbors did. And they throw in a 12-pack and we drive around and we feel so much better about our crops after we see what those guys are doing. This is 19 years ago, us doing crop patrol. Dad Seiler died and Mom didn't want to mow all the barn lot, so they just sprayed this out. This is where it had been plowed by Dad on and off again over this clay hill of Blount. And here's where they just sprayed that grass out and no-tilled in it. Look at the difference between this. Tell me that cover crops and the soil health stuff doesn't work. This is 19 years ago. That's the first year they planted it. Oh, gee whiz. Look, here's 2015. And look, it's still just torquing. That area is still green and bright and working for you in 2015. Les has done all this research on here. You can see the 2 shovels of soil, how much darker the one is from the other one. And he has done prescription mapping. And this is a thermal map. Look at this. This area has air in it. That's the barnyard. It's red hot. It's not cold like these other areas are, or right beside it where the plowing had gone on for years and years. This is just so encouraging. Here I am in Putnam County again, and I'm looking across this side of the road. This ground was worked, sealed off, water laying on top of it. And the other side of the road, all they did was they didn't work it, and it's draining. This is 2019, 50 years of no-till soybeans planted on June 26th. I made 50 bushel that wet year. This is 2020, last year, the same field, and that got out on May 11th this time, and I got 70 bushel beans. So we talked about how to protect yourself when things go wrong. Soil compaction in the wettest year on record. Principles of soil health, how to improve your drainage power with conservation systems by using no-till, strip till, zone till, controlled traffic, cover crops, and drainage. Use our certified professional soil scientists and soil classifiers. Farmers can make it work. Yes, you can. You can do it. Neil, that walked on the moon, Armstrong, he wasn't from Los Angeles. He wasn't from New York City. He wasn't even from Chicago. He was growed up in a farm town, Wapakoneta, Ohio. He could do it. Farmers can do it. I know you can. That's my presentation.
Thank you, Frank. Very interesting stuff. A lot of information. It's fantastic. Does anyone have any questions for Frank now? Plenty of time for questions. So once again, if you want to put those in the chat, or if you want to turn on your mics and ask Frank a question directly, you're welcome to do so at this point.
I also say that besides the publication that Eileen has, there is something if you're really into it, and I know Eileen has that. She's probably in the same drainage group, the Midwest Drainage Group. There's a formula called Drain Mod where you can estimate based on the layers of soil how far out the drainage tile will pull. And mostly we used it for wetland work, for setbacks on the tile so it didn't get too close and you get out of compliance by getting too close to a wetland. But it can be used the other way for agricultural crops too.
Hey, I have a question.
Yes.
It's Stephanie over here. I wanted to ask you a question about when you were talking about Dave Bransfield and how the soil had gotten so dark that it had to be reclassified. And I'm interested in just trying to understand, so when people improve soil health, right, or change their soil by adding organic matter and it gets darker, or say, through degradation, it gets lighter, right? And at some point in time, as a soil scientist, you say, well, it's not the same soil type anymore. But how is that even possible? Because the parent material is the same. All of those soil forming factors that develop those inherent properties are all the same from Dave Bransfield to his neighbor's field. So how can we track soil health changes and improvements over time if at some point in time a soil gets so much better that we change it to a different name or classify it as something else? Because then we lose that tracking history of how much it's changed over time.
Yeah, well, again, management. And what a wonderful thing if we had to reclassify the soils like Dave had. More likely what happens is we have terrible freaking erosion that takes away the topsoil so that you end up farming the subsoil, and then it has to be reclassified that way. And that's what basically the trajectory since our ancestors came in here 200 years ago is we've been mining ground and not putting back. And we got to do this. I was just a few years ago, 2 years ago, over in Spain, and you know, these people were showing me these olive terraces that have been like 500 years old, and they were saying, well, look at this, we've improved the water holding capacity of the soil so much that we had to reclassify it from the aeritic to the other classification I can run in my head right now, but the amount of water it will hold based on that. And I'm looking at this, folks, and this ground looked about the color of a cardboard box. And this professor from Barcelona, she was showing me all this. She'd done a study, international study on this, and on and on and on. And I said, Maria, I have to tell you, this soil looks terrible. It's just so pale and terrible looking. And she goes, she turned around and poked me in the chest and she said, you arrogant Americans, you're farming brand new soil 200 years old. Do you know what the Romans did to us? They came over here and cut all our trees down and made sailing ships and eroded the hills and destroyed everything 2,000 years ago. You just wait. And I'm like, whoa, lady, you're prophesying. I get it. I get it. Yeah, it's possible.
But why classify? Because then I feel like the history of degradation or improvement gets lost in the reclassification process. I feel like it just was like, oh, we're going to wipe the slate clean and just reclassify it as a new soil. And I feel like if we could find a way to track it and keep it classified as the same soil, that would.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah, well, you know what I'm like you forget that lineage or that change.
We do. I mean, the guys that are doing the mapping, the MLRA guys, that's something else we got into earlier. You guys weren't here, but that soil that you have in Indiana, that southeast station at Claremont, it's 60% silt. It's terrible. It's like trying to pour water through a bag of flour. If you have it in a woods, it works okay, but once you tear it out and destroy the structure, it's awful. And it was so bad that years ago, there used to be things were run state by state. Now they're being run by major land resource region. And so similar soils are managed across state lines by whoever's doing the mapping. But back in the day, Ohio discovered Claremont soils and named them after Claremont County, Ohio. And we ran the database, and you guys had that research center, and you came over and said, wow, look at all the things we're doing, what Eileen showed. This is good soil. It's prime farmland, but you guys have classified it not prime. And so we want you to change it. And Ohio said, no, we won't change it. And then you guys come back and said, well, you won't change it, huh? Well, ours is a little different. It doesn't have as much of fragipan in it. It's got fragic properties. Well, ours is a different soil. We're going to name it Cobb's Fork. And guess what? Cobb's Fork's prime. And so these crazy, even soils can be political. But that's all gone now because we're doing it on a bigger basis, and no state can run the database anymore. So that's a good way, bring it up to John Allen in your Indianapolis office. John's the one in charge of the Claremont. They're splitting Claremont 5 different ways now. It's not just Cobb's Fork and Claremont. So the more data you get and you keep track of it, that's the way to progress.
Thanks for the question, Stephanie. Thanks, Frank.
Thank you.
Just one other thing too. Frank had referenced Eileen's study as well. She's posted a recommendation for spacing of tiles in the chat. So if you want to reference that, I've also put, Frank, I hope that's okay, your email in the chat as well if anybody has any other questions. And looks like Matt has offered you some adult beverages to come down to Southern Indiana, and he started covers and no-till. So if you want to exchange that for some guidance on surface drainage, he's offered that up to you, but I'll let you guys discuss that further after the fact. So but yes, Frank, thank you very much. Great information, a lot of information. So hopefully everybody was able to soak that up, no pun intended, and get some benefit from that. So thank you again.
Thank you, guys.
Yes. So we will go ahead and move on to our third speaker. He is Dr. Jerry Sweden, Professor Emeritus of Biology and Environmental Studies at Manchester University and the co-founder of Ecosystems Connections Institute. He'll be speaking about the work he's been doing in Beargrass Creek watershed, specifically a 2-stage ditch project on Beargrass Creek. So with that being said, I will turn it over to Dr. Sweden so he can start his presentation.
All right, so everyone can see this, okay, right? We good? All right.
That's good.
Thank you so much. I'll say that Eileen and Frank, it's wonderful to see some really exciting innovations and some old school approach to agronomy to help productivity and hold water in place. And I am not an agronomist. I'm a stream restoration ecologist. And as Colin mentioned, I retired from teaching at Manchester College, which would be located someplace right in here. And the Eel River runs through the campus and right out our back door. And when I started working there, it looked like a beautiful place to have a research laboratory. And so we started getting involved in looking at what's actually flowing down the river. A lot of the work that's been presented has been on, of course, drainage and soil health. And what we wanted to know is what sort of loss of nutrients and sediment is moving through the channel. What are some opportunities for restoring the Eel River Basin? And so that led us to taking out dams. We've actually removed 4 dams from the Eel River Basin and have permits to take out the last 2 at Logansport. And we actually put in a prototype fish ladder at Stockdale, which is about in the middle of the basin, that once the Logansport dams are removed, the entire basin will be reconnected for fish. So what I'm going to talk to you though about now is this green subwatershed, which is Beargrass Creek. Beargrass Creek is about 15,000 acres. It is about 86% row crop agriculture. There's over 400,000 hogs in this subwatershed. It was listed as a National Water Quality Initiative watershed, and we had a chance to work there by setting out some water quality gauges. One, yellow, which is represented by this yellow dot, and then the red dot with about 2,500 acres above it. We were interested in knowing what the loadings of sediment and nutrients were moving past these points. And then that's sort of the science side, but then we were also got interested in sort of the social science side of what can we do to help encourage farmers to participate in cost share programs for a lot of the things that we heard Eileen and Frank speak about. And in fact, one of the things we discovered is that there was a huge cultural disconnect between the college students, the college itself, and the farmers in this subwatershed. And as soon as the farmers heard we were going to be doing some work here, there was a lot of relationship building that was required. I think a lot of the farmers thought college students were just a bunch of beer drinking party people, and the college students weren't really quite sure about farmers. But over time, we built some very positive relationships. In fact, so much so that the farming community actually made cash contributions to keep some of our work, water quality work going since 2014. So it's been a very productive watershed to work in. We built some wonderful relationships. A lot of our work was funded by the Indiana Corn Marketing Council and the Indiana Soybean Alliance, and also the Environmental Defense Fund. So, of course, we're interested in non-point source pollution, nitrogen, phosphorus, and stream sediment. And I can tell you from our work, I will just tell you that there is a tremendous amount of nitrogen and phosphorus and mostly sediment moving through stream channels, at least in this part of the world where we were working. And as a stream ecologist, one of the questions that we wrestle with is, so what is the biological effect of that on organisms in a stream? And we don't always have a clear connection between that. In my work, one of the things we have that I've worked on is looking at the effect of suspended sediment, the mud in the water that you can see pictured here, and the effect that it's had on survival and growth of smallmouth bass, very common sports fish. And we've been able to show that an untimely rain during the spawn, or when the larval fish rise from the nest, it can completely eliminate or eliminate a year class of smallmouth bass. And so what we do know, though, and we've continued to learn more, is what happens when this nutrient and sediment-laden water gets ponded up. The hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico, the western basin of Lake Erie. Since retirement and starting Ecosystems Connections, we're doing a large project at Lake Wallacy called the Wallacy Inlet Nutrient Study, where we have gauge stations at every inlet of that lake. And we look at water coming into the lake, what's going out, and how's it being processed in the lake. And one of the things we've learned is that this is one of the first scientific studies of a glacial lake in northern Indiana. And what we have learned is that there is far more nutrients entering, especially phosphorus and nitrogen, entering Lake Wallacy than anyone ever had expected. So these are challenging ecologically. We know that, I mean, from our work in Beargrass Creek, farmers don't want this stuff to move. And then as stream people, we prefer to see it stay up on the fields. We know that from historical perspective that streams were very different prior to European settlement and drainage. has come along. We had braided channels in many parts of the state. Much of the state was very wet. Over time, we've changed these natural streams, and we've confined them to mostly linear farm ditches that, and we may have, in some cases, 3 to 20 feet of legacy sediment that's been deposited on top of some of this historical floodplains where streams used to flow. And so from an ecological side of things, this creates a real issue. And in the case of agriculture, of course, these drainage ditches are primarily a conduit for removing excess water, which, and Frank, as you mentioned, you're trying to keep up on the landscape, and Eileen talked about with some of the tile. So this is the upper end. I'm going to just share with you one example of one of our restoration initiatives on Beargrass Creek. You can see our water quality gauge station here. This is the upstream gauge station. Inside there's an automatic water sampler, a rain gauge. We have an inlet that we pull water from, and we would take 6 samples a day during May and June, and then weekly grab samples throughout the rest of the year. There's 2,500 acres above this gauge station, and it's on private farmland, of course, and we had full permission. And so I would often send students to this site to collect a weekly grab sample. One day, and this is 2013, it was in November, a student came back and said, well, I have the water sample, but he said that there's quite a few dead fish in the ditch. And of course, that kind of made everybody start wondering, well, what's going on? So I called my good friend and colleague, Joe Updike, who was the district conservationist in Wabash County at the time, and perhaps some of you know Joe. And he came out to the site, we looked at it together, and he made some calls, and the next day we had 9 farmers up at the college in a conference room, and everybody sort of looking at each other, and they all said, well, we didn't do anything. And so it was, of course, people sort of suspected that maybe there was some manure spill, or who knew what. Well, it turned out that it was none of those things. We had a great conversation with the farmers, and it turned out to be a positive. But this is a very typical linear tree-lined farm ditch that simply dropped so much organic matter in the water, and it was sort of during a low flow period that decomposition of those leaves simply drove the dissolved oxygen from the water and caused the fish kill. So that made us start thinking, well, what could we do in this situation that would provide drainage for the farmers, but also restore this stream into a system that would be more ecologically sound. Here's a picture of this same ditch during a heavy rain. In fact, Frank, I believe this is 2015, which you referred to in your previous talk. And you can see the flooding that exists this ditch coming up out of its bank with all of the trees lining the ditch. The farmer who we work with, you can see their farm is right over here, and he was very cooperative. In our design, our study design, what we decided to do was to try to build a natural channel design or a 2-stage ditch. But we also wanted to know what would be the response of the stream relative to the fish and the stream habitat. How would there be a response from the small mammals, large mammals? What about nesting birds? And how about water quality? Now, many of you probably looked at that picture, previous picture, and you saw all those trees lining the ditch. And so this is the novel part of this project, is that we had to get special permits to actually remove the trees to reshape the channel. The farmer who owned this property, he actually, before that we removed the trees to do this project, he took me back to this site and he said, here's some major issues with having trees growing on the ditch bank. And I'm sure that all of you can relate to this. And you can see the erosion that has taken place from the instability of the stream banks. And this obviously contributed a tremendous amount of sediment entering the stream, plus legacy nutrients that could be attached to the soil. So it took a lot of hard work to get permission to do this experiment and to remove the trees and reshape the channel. But in 2016, we were awarded a grant from the United States Fish and Wildlife Service actually to do this project. It came fully funded, and the two-stage ditch that we constructed was 1,500 feet long. Perhaps many of you, I stole this picture off the internet, by the way, and I didn't give any credits to it. It's a fairly generic, a conventional ditch with steep sides, a low flow channel, and then the high flow channel and the tile maybe above that or maybe not. And then the two-stage ditch simply gives back a small floodplain to the stream or to the ditch. We have the low flow channel inside. Often these benches are set at the 2-year flood elevation and expands the availability of space for the water. Generally, slopes would be back at least at a 3-to-1 slope. This one is pictured probably too steep. And then this would all be vegetated and stabilize the banks. And so this is the work that's was under construction in 2017. And you can see the low flow channel. Well, we did nothing in the channel itself. We left it to meander rather than straighten it out. That was a bit difficult for the farmer who saw that, who thought it should be straight, but we wanted to see more of a response of how the fish and the wildlife responded to this restoration effort. But you can see the banks sloped at a 3-to-1 slope, and this bench is about 12 feet across here and 12 feet on this on what we would call river right. We finished the work and seeded it in warm season grasses in what's called a swale mix. So it's just not fescue grass. It was a mixture of forbs and grasses that were designed for floodplains of streams. And then on the upside, the farmer committed to a 120-foot buffer on both sides that was planted to warm season grasses. Well, this is in November of 2016, after the construction was finished, and we had some growth of cover crop that we put on there just to stabilize the soil. And all the time we're collecting water samples here at the gauge station. This is spring of 2017, an untimely rain because we really weren't quite ready. We didn't think that, of course, the grass wasn't mature, the plants weren't mature, but amazingly, during this heavy rain, we noticed that it never spilled out into the field, and you can see the velocity of the water really slowed down, and the capacity of that ditch to carry the water was increased significantly. So this is 2019. The buffer on this side of the stream is now planted. Hasn't matured yet. And you can see the stream, the low flow channel is beginning to develop point bars and riffles and pools as a normal stream would look. And so this whole stream, and we have cross sections. We did a lot of surveying. I'm not going to share that information with you today because of time, but we have a lot of data relative to the channel geometry and how it changed. And again, all the time this was going on, we did a breeding bird survey before the work began. We continued to monitor birds. We electrofish this stream every year before and after construction. So we have a lot of biological data of how this system changed. This is 2020. Again, you can see these point bars beginning to develop, lots of vegetative cover. The stream bank erosion has simply gone away. And this top buffer on both sides now is in warm season grasses. And in fact, the farmer burned that off this spring as a way of controlling trees. And it's just a good healthy thing to do for warm season grasses. So in our gauge stations, I thought I might just quickly show this to you. This is a Nisco water sampler. I'm sure, Eileen, you probably use these, and maybe there's other folks out there that use them as well. As I mentioned, inside there are 24 bottles. We have this program to take a sample every 4 hours in this particular system. And so we collected six samples a day in May and June, and then weekly grab samples thereafter. So we looked at this project as, oh, I should show you this. I guess I forgot I had this slide in here. I'm sorry. This is why automatic samplers are so important. Much of the water quality assessment that takes place particularly in Indiana, I'm not sure about other states, is what somebody would call a grab sample, where you would randomly go out and get a bottle of water. But you could see how the data could be really skewed if you would pick this day to go out and collect that bottle of water. And then later, maybe you pick this day, and you could see how quickly the water quality can change. And just by looking at the concentration of the sediment that's in those bottles. And I can tell you that as sediment increases in the water, so does phosphorus. And phosphorus, of course, is one of the major contributors to a lot of the algal blooms that we see in the glacial lakes, western basin of Lake Erie as well. So we viewed this project as it was a place for undergraduates at the college that I could get involved in research. It was a place where they could interact with the farming community and help them to better understand the farming community, and then farmers to understand and build a relationship with the college students. It gave the students a chance to work with professional folks in natural resources, everywhere from the United Fish and Wildlife Service to the local Soil and Water Conservation District. And so there were just a lot of interaction between a variety of natural resource agencies. And as you probably all know, that it's not always, we don't always cross over discipline lines very much. So, you know, an agronomist would tend to stay more in an agronomy field. Somebody like me, I rarely would start tipping my toe into the agronomy world. But this project allowed for interaction across disciplines and provided a wonderful opportunity for the students to college. And this research is continuing today, where we're continuing to look at how the bird community has shifted from sort of a small tree and shrub habitat to more of a grassland habitat. And we see that in the bird community. We've seen a shift in the fish community. We've seen our index scores have increased, not only just the habitat, but the numbers of fish and the species of fish that live in that small stream. So these are our partners. It's been great to share this with you. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Yes, thanks, Dr. Sweden. Appreciate you taking the time to present. So as Dr. Sweden said, if you have any questions, once again, encouraged to put those in the chat or turn on your mic and ask him directly. So. And Dr. Sweden, if you don't mind, I'll put your email address in the chat. Is that okay with you?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. You bet. You bet.
Yep. So, okay. Well, if there's no questions, like I said, I will put Dr. Sweden's email in the chat. So if you are interested in discussing more about the Beargrass Creek project and the two-stage ditch with him, you can do that after the fact. But once again, thanks, Dr. Sweden. And we will move on to our fourth speaker, our final presentation for the event. Up next is Ed Ferris. He's a Purdue Extension educator. He's going to be talking about Indiana manure and fertilizer applicator regulations and record keeping. So Ed, go ahead. It's all yours.
Okay, can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so we're going to go through this fairly quickly. I know in the essence of time. I would just ask if there's anybody that's a commercial applicator, category 1, category 14, if you would just put in the chat box that you are a commercial applicator, because I know there's a possibility you are and you did not contact me, but if you could just share that with us, I'd appreciate that. And so we're going to go ahead, and I know I've got a list of PARP people, and I may, there are some PARP people that don't have their name. If you could, if your name is not on the screen, could you please type the correct name so I can make sure we get credit where credit's due. So we'll go ahead here and talk about manure and fertilizer in regards to the state of Indiana. And, just these are pictures. We're talking about regulating nutrients. We've been talking about this all afternoon, and this is nitrogen delivered, and you can, we talk about the hypoxia in the Gulf of Mexico. These are things that you've heard many times, most of you, and phosphorus. And these are just maps across the country. So we're just going to talk about beginning with fertilizer. And so there's two types of fertilizer materials. You have the inorganic and the organic. Manure and compost would be the organic, and potash and anhydrous ammonia will be inorganic. We're not talking about lime and gypsum and that type of thing here. So when you're talking about manure, any person distributing less than 10 cubic yards or 4,000 gallons of any type of fertilizer material. But I know this always comes up. This is something that you may have remembered from a few years ago, but they talked about, how much manure is produced by each animal per year. So if you have one steer, that's enough that you need to have some kind of records as to how you're applying that manure. That can just be something that you've written down to say, you've got the amount of acres to spread that manure. But that's just something the state of Indiana that they've had on the books for several years now. Again, they're looking at confined feeding operations and operations outside of Indiana that would be transferring the manures. That's for those that apply or transfer manure. And so these rules that I'm going to be talking about are specific to these people. Anybody in the state has to have some kind of record, if you've got that amount of animal that you're producing, to have on record. But what the Office of Indiana State Chemist is concerned about are these types of operations for transporting and applying. So again, any person applying fertilizer material for hire must have the applicator license and be working for a licensed company. That applies to manure from a confined feeding operation and from the out-of-state as well. So we're looking at the Category 14 certification, and you can see this is what the licenses would look like. And again, manure that's custom applied does not require the grower to be certified. So if you're a crop grower and you're getting manure from a confined feeding operation that is custom applied, you don't have to be certified, but the person that is applying that does have to be certified. It's just like restricted use pesticides and private pesticide applicators. But if you have your own, CFO, then you need to have a private, Category 14. Obviously, that's something that was stressed many years ago. And just want to go through, this is real quickly the plan for both, I already mentioned, for manure and inorganic fertilizer applications. And I think most crop growers do work with, somebody with a firm or agronomist, or they have their own plans that as to what type of rates they're using. And so that's really what you need, is just some kind of documentation if there's ever questions. And staging is something important to recognize, that's a temporary placement of the product in a pile in preparation for field application. And again, if they're behind the barn, that's not identified as staging. But this is for inorganic fertilizer. We have these restrictions, 300 feet of surface water. You cannot place you know, for more than the 72 hours. And if you are, that needs to be covered, and it can be staged along the property line if, but it's got to be, again, after 72 hours needs to be covered. And if you are looking at manure, it's got to be bermed after 72 hours if you're going to be spreading that manure. And so within 300 feet of surface water, drainage inlets or water wells, and obviously standing water or waterway or floodway is not acceptable. So we have staging restrictions here, again, for manure, and you know, not on the side of a hill 100 feet from the property line if you're staging it, and if you're 400 feet from residential buildings, and it has to be applied within 90 days. And again, that berming has to be done. Let's go back after 72 hours, the pile needs to be covered or bermed. So here's the fertilizer materials. This is pretty standard. You know, you can't apply to public roads, water, saturated ground. And if you can't get in the field, then if you can get in the field, then it's not saturated. And so there's difference with fertilizer material. So these are, again, some things you can find on the state chemist website. We're going to just, you know, talk about these real, not dwell on these too long today because for the essence of time. But we, you know, there are restrictions as far as application for manure. And, you know, for when you're talking about public water supply, surface water, sinkholes, water wells, drainage inlets, property lines, and public roads. And there's a difference if you're incorporating within 24 hours or if you're directly injecting. And so there's, again, application restrictions. Again, these are all on the state chemist website, so please refer to that. The manure organic applications to highly erodible land, you know, unless the land has at least 40% crop residue or vegetative cover, you know, the state chemist rules are that, you know, do not apply manure to that type of land. And there is special permission. I don't going to go into this at this stage, but there is more. You do have to get special permission from IDEM to apply manure to frozen ground if you're a CFO. And one thing that I wanted to highlight here is precision mapping. These are just some examples of how you might with precision ag, how, you know, you're mapping these things out. You got the well point, the catch basin or standpipe. You've got your ditches, and you got so these are all buffer areas. You can go ahead and, as you're making these applications, make sure that you think about these when you're applying manure or fertilizer, so that, you know, you don't that you're within the state guidelines. And as this says, with controllers connected to GPS, we can control where the application is allowed. Green is applied and red is shut off. So I may be the only one here that's colorblind, but I have a trouble with red and green, but it's all kind of blends together. So I would prefer two different colors, but this is just showing, you know, the red and the greens when you have things, an example for your applying to make sure that you think about the state guidelines. And just a real quick reminder about the records: keep them for 2 years, record within 30 days of application. There's not a specific form required. With restricted use pesticide, you know, this is just some brief required information, details that just as a reminder. And all these things are important: location, your permit number, your date of application, you know, what pest and acres you're treating, the rate, the amount used, the brand name information, the manufacturer. All these things should be somewhere if in case there's a question that comes up, and you are visited by the state chemist office. So fertilizer application records. Category 14 private applicators keep records of manure applications, and category 14 commercial applicators keep records of their inorganic fertilizer and manure applications, and keep these for 2 years. And if you're a company that, you know, maintain the records for their customers is necessary as well. And just again, the legal access for pesticide records, a state chemist, if they want to come by and you know, you need to be able to have those records available for them. And if there's some kind of situation or emergency, a licensed healthcare professional does have legal access. So that's the real quick details of manure and fertilizer applications. I did want to share the part number, and I will be that you can record, and I will also follow up with an email for those I know that are on that have stayed part of this presentation this afternoon. I will send you an email with this information as well. Your sign up is if you've paid, you should have paid through the CVent link ahead of time. So that, again, this is for private applicators only. If you are a commercial applicator, then I would need to actually have your license number emailed to me to make sure they get that recorded on the proper documentation to send to the state. And if you are a crop advisor, I have not applied yet for the credits, but we can do that afterwards if you would like, or you can self-report. You just get in touch with me, and we can work out something with the crop advisor credits. Okay, yeah, I just noticed Andrew Blair, thank you for sharing your name there. I see that Andrew's up there. He's one that I know contacted me ahead of time. So if there's others that, again, if you don't have your name on the screen, just let me know that you are viewing today. And I'll turn it back over to Colin. Is there any other questions that people would have? I know we went through things quickly, and again, there are lots of good information on the State Chemist website, and I can email you directly and share that information with you following the program too, or you can contact me directly.
Okay, I had a question. You mentioned one steer basically on a year basis or something like that, you'd have to report. What about like if you just graze cover crops for 3 months, is that four steers?
Well, what that's saying is that you know, you should have some records of if you're applying that much manure. That I think it's let me go back to look at that amount. It's a 10 cubic yards per year. Then what a steer produces 10 cubic yards. So you need to just be able to explain it, that how you're applying that manure, that you're not just you know, putting it somewhere where near a waterway or something where it's not that you're applying it. You have the amount of acreage that you can apply that manure. So does that make sense?
Yeah, but I just, you know, wasn't sure what the details were, if you had to then report or not. And then, you know, what about rotational grazing too? Because
yeah, that's right. That's part of that would be something. If you're ever questioned by a state official, you know, if you've got records as to how you're applying the manure is what we're talking about. This is if you've got animals on pasture and you're at certain times of the year, that's certainly important to note when you're But the main thing that the state is concerned about is manure that's staged, or you know, the people that are producing the manure have have the acreage available and they're applying it correctly. They're not applying it to the snow or frozen cover ground and that type of thing. So thanks for your questions.
Yeah. Any other questions for Ed? Okay, thank you, Ed. Appreciate taking time. So I'd like to ask everybody for just one favor. We have 3 poll questions just to kind of gauge your experience today. So those should be made available on your screen now, and they are anonymous. So please feel free to go ahead and answer those 3 questions. While you're doing that, I just want to take some time to thank some people for their aid in setting this workshop up. So first, Ed, thank you again. Ed helped out a lot and orchestrating the event and getting it set up. So thanks, Ed. I'd like to thank Sheila Schroeder, the North Program Manager with CCSI. She wasn't able to attend today, but she put in a lot of work behind the scenes to help organize the event and advertise it. So I'd like to thank her as well. Cheryl Jarrett with the Huntington County Soil and Water Conservation District for participating and helping organize. And then also Jessica Hain, who has stepped in today to help facilitate things and make sure things run smoothly. So thank you to all of you for your help in organizing things and advertising and so on. Thank you to all 4 of the speakers for taking time out of your days to present the information to everyone. And then for all of you who attended today for taking time out of your days. Hopefully you learned something new and you go away with some new information that you can apply to your farm systems moving forward. So there's still some of you who haven't participated in the poll, so I'll give you guys a couple more minutes to do that. But once again, thanks for joining us today. Okay. Looks like we've got everyone that's gonna